Hello and welcome to Cinema 105 again. So this week's topic, we are in week 7. We're covering journalism and news media. So we're going to be talking about a lot of interesting topics. Let's get into it. Okay. American news media. So we're in week 7, journalism and news. I'd like you to start thinking about your final paper. What topic do you want to explore? Review the final paper module in week 11. The optional videos included in each module could be a good source of inspiration. So there's lots of extra videos that we don't get to in the class. You might go through there and see if there's one that interests you, and that could be the spark or the start of your research. What you will do is write a paper proposal that will be submitted. It must be approved by me. So you don't just get to pick your topic. You can do any topic you want following the guidelines, but I do steer people away from certain topics that don't work as well. Okay, journalism is printing what someone else does not want printed. Everything else is public relations. George Orwell, famous author, important statement. So taking a look at the news media, we have a variety of different ones. We have the global news gathering organizations, some of the prominent print publications, major corporate news, like your evening news here, alternative media, online news, various qualities, BuzzFeed, kind of lower quality, Bloomberg and Reddit offering great news services, and of course, conspiracy media. Now, remember, we are still in the time of media consolidation. I just want to remind us of that. This is a chart showing all the various properties owned by the 6 major media corporations, 5 operating primarily in the US. Bartelsman is over in Europe. So we have 5 in the US controlling all of these various things, publications, radio, television, publishing. So what we live in is an atmosphere of corporate news, and the mainstream media, sometimes abbreviated MSM, is corporate news. It promotes the dominant ideologies of America, most particularly capitalism. Divergent ideas are rarely entertained unless to be mocked. And McLuhan reminds us, every society honors its live conformists and its dead troublemakers. So Orwell is remembered as important for his publication 1984 and others. He famously said, "The people will believe what the media tells them to believe." His 1984 is one of the most quoted and important books of the 20th century. It portrays a dystopian world of totalitarian rule that subjugates people with a ministry of disinformation. So here are the topics that we're going to go over: sensationalism, news bias, image politics in America, newspapers in decline, journalism in decline, of course, fake news, and then end with some inspiration and some guidance with a little lecture on how to be media literate and hope for our journalism. So here's an example of world press visualized. As you can see, there are many countries here in black and red. Almost all of Asia have very poor journalistic freedoms, and indeed journalists are under threat there in these countries. But look at the US, only rated as satisfactory. Only Northern Europe even makes it into the green, into the good. So we see that all over the world there are pressure on the press because it's their job to unearth the truth and expose it to the general public. Yet, despite that, trust in mainstream media has been in decline for years across the political spectrum, as we can see in the chart here. Lack of trust is particularly pronounced amongst millennials. A Harvard study found that just 9% of millennials trust the media, all or most of the time. And as we'll see, other institutions did not fare any better. Trust in organized religion, public schools, the Supreme Court of the United States, banks and Congress, organized labor, and criminal justice system have all seen a decline in public trust since about 2006. Now, interestingly, big business, corporations, has remained the same at about 18%. I would say this is a product of consumerism, will for ignorance, and a dazzling PR campaign by corporations. So public trust is eroding. In the past, national evening news programs, local evening news programs, and the front pages of print newspapers were dominated by fact reporting stories. Now, however, many news sources are actually dominated by analysis and opinion pieces. So a lot of people, as we can see in the chart here, half of the US adults feel confident in news media, only half, okay? Some people will think it's a good idea to be skeptical of the news media. Now, Fox, it undermines the news media, often critiquing media in general on its broadcasts. Republicans more generally have driven an erosion of media credibility, often critiquing the media in general without providing specifics. And of course, Donald Trump, while president, will frequently critique the media and even popularize the term fake news. So up next, we have media sensationalism. Now, I'm sure you know what this is. It uses fear, anger, and crude thrills to increase viewership, ratings, and profits. Celebrity scandals, disasters, murder, all make for great headlines, including haircuts that kill. Now, we've all seen tabloid rags, and they're laughable, sure, but now we have tabloid websites, tabloid video places. There's TMZ. Dramatic headlines get clicks, and advertisers know this, and publications know this. Mobile users in particular are looking for quick bites of information to buy the time, not lengthy, think pieces. Sensational headlines and stories are perfect for, say, commuting to work or waiting on the bus or waiting in line. Every click is counted and the score is kept. Uh, Look at this one. Which Taco Bell menu speaks to you on a spiritual level? So some of these are absurd. Sensational headlines grab attention. Sensationalized news doesn't inform, it incites. It's designed to play on your emotion, not your thinking. The news may be trivial, but the effect on you is real. It distracts you from real news stories of import. And of course, celebrity gossip being the worst possible example. Often we'll see negative tone in the newspaper, and one of the reasons is that gets clicks. As we can see from the chart, a lot of negative tone to news reporting. McLuhan even says advertising is the only good news in the newspaper. Uh, Big headlines, danger, something to be afraid of. Fear is an even greater motivator than success or pursuing leisure, okay? Just something that has to do with our psychology. When we perceive a potential threat, that becomes immediate in our attention, therefore garnering a click. So clicks equal advertising money. When it comes to chasing clicks, journalists say one thing, but they feel a pressure to do another. Online media, which is where publications are going, online media is made of clicks. To grab attention, you got to grab attention to get clicks, okay? Readers click from one article to the next, and advertising numbers and revenue is based on those unique visitors. Editors keep this in mind, and writers and bloggers keep this in mind. It's a signal of popularity. So we often will see sensationalized and scare tactics in media to attract attention. Here's the point. As the mainstream media has become increasingly dependent on advertising revenues for support, it has become an anti-democratic force in society. This from Robert Machesi, known author and communications professor. So to break it down, media is dependent on advertising money. Advertisers have demands on content and viewership. They don't want you running an article about a danger in the design of the car that they've made. Media must attract clicks, eyeballs with content, okay? They've got to pay for the whole operation. So maybe these trashy stories help pay for the real stories. Sensationalism, fear, and conflict attract more attention. Media often promotes sensationalism, fear, and conflict to maintain advertising revenue. This is the cycle that goes round. So now we're going to talk about news bias. And first, bias, let's explain that, is a tendency, inclination, or prejudice towards or against something or someone. We see the world as we want. So it's prejudice. Racism would be a form of bias, an extreme form. Now, we all have some bias in us. We all like chocolate over vanilla. We enjoy people of this type of personality over this type of personality. We have different biases, and we have to be aware of those. I have biases as well. I try to be as neutral as I can. But as I say to students, you teach me your cultural icons and I'll teach you mine. and we'll try to get through this and understand each other clearly and try to come to some factual understanding that's as much as possible removed from bias. Okay, media bias. So here we see examples of it from Time magazine, different front covers for different parts of the world. While the revolutions were going on, the US heard about anxiety. So this is an example of agenda setting theory. Media doesn't tell you what to think, it tells you what to think about. And let's remember cultivation theory. Media cultivates your perception of the world by the images you watch. So one of the things that we see in the media is a perceived left-right paradigm. So we have these different media sources which are perceived to be along this line here, and some publications are more conservative, others are more liberal, and the media sort of perceives things this way. But bias drives traffic. In this chart, we see the extreme polarization of opinion lead up to the 2020 election. The more conservative voices are driving much more traffic. As the election rhetoric heated, closer you got to the election, whoops, more traffic was driven to those sites. In the heated political environment, consumers were drawn to heated extreme speech that appealed to their emotion, that appealed to their tribal beliefs. So if you're really upset about what the Democrats are doing, an article which tells you why you should be more upset is going to be attractive to you. And the opposite, of course, is true. So here we see a rather detailed breakdown of the American media across political spectrum. And so from left to right, we have more liberal all the way over to very extreme conservative. And then from the bottom to the top, the ones in the top are doing original fact reporting. And these are the more respected news organizations. And they might be slightly to the left or slightly to the right. As we go down the scale, we get into propaganda and with misleading and fabricated info. And so in this red box, they would really advise that you steer clear of these. And these you got to watch out for. This is probably going to be where you fall if you have a left or right bias. But a couple of things I want to point out. Notice that it's kind of like a bell curve. We have different tastes in media depending on where we are politically. So this is a result of the destruction of the fairness doctrine. We have essentially different media outlets appealing to the extreme right, the extreme left, whatever, everything in between, in a way to attract attention, not necessarily serving the needs of the republic, but a way to generate outcome. If a liberal media says something outlandish in liberal media, it's going to be very popular with the people who buy that magazine and read it, but it may or may not be true or necessarily good for the democracy. So now let's compare New Zealand. Now, New Zealand's a much, much smaller country, granted, but notice how most of their press is sort of in the middle. None of it's lurking down here in the bottom. None of it's too far extreme right or too far extreme left. This is the way the United States used to be. But what we've seen is this sort of spread into a much more extreme to appeal, to draw attention, and also to get clicks and therefore advertising revenue. Here we see it broken down, and a couple of things to mention here. Avoid news titles with bias in the title. Avoid news sources that insult or ignore alternative news. Don't live in a bubble. And so there's different ideas to think about. Diversify your intake and be wary of human interest stories about murder, kidnapping, crime. Very often these sensationalized stories are popular and they draw clicks, but they really offer no news value. The truth can be flexible in service to the situation. Hannity in 2008, Obama's willingness to meet North Korea is one of the most disturbing displays of Obama's lack of foreign policy experience. 10 years later, Hannity says Trump's willingness to meet with North Korea is a huge foreign policy win for President Trump. Fox News, which Hannity works for, didn't even want to cover the January 6 hearings. I think as they went on and got more salacious, they finally jumped in. But in the beginning, they refused to cover their proceedings, and they even broadcast their own news broadcast that evening without commercials so that their audience wouldn't be tempted to channel flip. So one of the things that Fox News does is it tells you what to think about the hearings before they even begin, or any topic. So here's an example. Leaders will spend 90 minutes giving moral lecture. So they've already told you how to think and feel. They've given you the conclusion. and why you should watch out for it, not giving you just pure information of what's about to happen. Now, often in the media across the spectrum, we see the incident of shooters displayed differently. Muslim shooters will often make the entire religion of Islam responsible, as if they were involved. Black shooters will be connected to drugs or gang violence. White shooters will be a lone wolf. So we see different characterizations as pushed through the media, different narratives. Media create narratives to drive the story and attract attention. So let's get a couple of techniques. We've talked about a few. So first off, bias by story selection. Okay, for example, only focusing on immigration tragedies, like the one immigrant who comes across the border and commits a crime. Bias by omission. Capitalism is never questioned or considered in discussions on evening news. Story placement. Where is the story placed? Is it on the front page or is it buried? Okay, is it prominently displayed on the website or is it sort of hidden? Bias by selection of sources. So speaking to only one side of the sources, getting very biased experts and offering one side of the story. An example, asking only generals to comment on war. And bias by labeling, using extreme labels, adjectives, and language to paint subjects in a biased light. So anytime that you see a news source tell you how to feel about somebody, known terrorist, known criminal, they're telling you how to feel about somebody. So another aspect to watch out for is the left-right paradigm, and we see this prominently in the media. Americans are more divided than ever now by political ideology, as a recent Pew Center study makes clear. About a third of people on each side say that the other side, the proponents of the other side, are so misguided that they threaten the nation's well-being. Well, they both might be right about that. So we're really left with a false left-right choice. And we see that there's a lot of animosity in the country. And part of this is driven by the false left-right paradigm propagated on media, as we can see here in the cartoon. Americans will vote in one president. They won't like what he does. They vote in the other. And American politics have kind of been forced into this left-right conflict that ensures nothing changes. Most modern democracies have multiple parties serving diverse perspectives and interests. So you'll have 3 or 4 left parties, 3 or 4 right parties. The US only has 2. Framing politics through only a black and white lens limits discussion and it marginalizes diverse opinion. Now let's see how it's changed over time. So here's 1984. You see that, the average Democrat and the average Republican weren't that far apart. And the opinions, some folks were more left and you had some extremes on both sides. But now look at what's happened over time. The median person has gotten further apart. They've gotten more extreme as the extremes have gotten more so. Even so, even with all that, I want to notice that, look, there's still a pretty large middle here, this purple where right-wing and left-wing views meet. And very often this middle isn't catered to politically or in the media. So yes, it's true the extremes have grown and we have a very dire situation. But I think that this middle still is a strong force that's not properly addressed. So this has created a political divide. And mainstream media propagates this idea of a left-right paradigm. Many channels will feature a liberal versus a conservative in debates. Arguments on TV attract viewers. And the left-right debate gives the illusion of fairness. Well, so Fox News will have a liberal on that will appear to offer some liberal points of view, although the conservative will typically dominate on that channel. And the same might happen on a liberal channel with a conservative guest. So this all leads to polarization. Okay, it's a forced opposite. You've got to be in your camp. Okay, so it leads to no compromise in Congress, leads to each side seeing the other side as the enemy. How can you even think about compromising with the enemy and their terrible beliefs? It leads to violent words and actions being carried out, as we've seen in Charlottesville and other places. And what it does is it retrieves tribal consciousness. It makes people go back into tribal consciousness. In other words, thinking just about the people they know that are in their immediate surroundings, their tribe, people that agree and operate as they do. So McLuhan says, the news automatically becomes the real world for the TV user. And it's not a substitute for reality, but is itself an immediate reality. People get upset watching TV and get angry from what they see. So last point, American press doesn't cover politics. It covers politicians. So look at the negative coverage that Clinton and Trump both received. The negative is in the blue, or the issues is in the blue. So they only cover 28% on issues, but look at the negative coverage, much more negative on all candidates than any discussion of their issues. Politics in America are covered like a horse race. Personalities are covered, not politics. Emotions, not intellect. Presidential races become a popularity contest rather than a debate of issues and ideas. And much attention is paid to mistakes. What did they say? How did they gaffe? Voter confidence stems from a candidate's image and impressions, not policy statements. McLuhan says, politics will eventually be replaced by imagery. The politician will be all too happy to abdicate in favor of his image because the image will be much more powerful than he ever could be. The image moves freely without the body, as we see from Star Wars. Okay, that brings us to our first question. Okay, section 1 is done. So question 1, how has the mass media contributed to the national political divide? How has the mass media, so everything we just discussed, contributed to the national political divide that we clearly see? So write down the question and answer in Canvas. You can choose to do that now, or you can continue on with me. Here we go. Death of newspapers leading to death of journalism. Okay. So take a look. 50% of readers are gone. 50% of journalists have vanished over the last 15 years. Circulation's down. They've closed tons of papers. I mean, the numbers are all going down. Here's another one. Circulation down. Okay, employment down. Only digital is going up for digital native publishing and journalists. Everybody else going down. Print advertising, steep decline. Okay, starts around 2012. Starts earlier, really at 2000 when the internet was introduced. And here's the real chart. So as we see newspapers, advertising spending or advertising earning revenue going down, we see digital climbing. It's obvious what's happening here. And we've seen this chart before in numerous examples of where we see traditional older media on the decline, and we see digital and new media on the rise. And we know why. Younger generations are adapting. Older generations that still stick with old media are themselves dying off. And Jill Abersom says there are not many places left that do quality news well or even aim to do it at all. One example is the New York Times, and I just wanted to point this out. Unintended consequences. Something called the Trump bump happened. New York Times readership goes up despite them being labeled fake news. So Trump was very critical of the New York Times through his campaign, and then when he became president. And during his time, bam, right when he became president, the New York Times got a bump, which it sustained for some time. So this is an example of unintended consequences. It's an example of when you name your enemy, you give them power. So it's a growing problem. Newspaper, so we've got a declining, newspaper reporters. Here we see an example of reporters at the State House, fewer of them there. And here's the problem. Newspaper reporters do the baseline on the ground reporting that all news media, corporate and independent, rely on for their stories. Often TV news just goes to the location for some exterior shots with the reporter, but all the news was written by a better trained newspaper journalist. Print reporters cover consistent beats day after day. TV reporters show up for a shot. Okay, TV reporters aren't at the State House. They're waiting for something to happen to show up. So also we're seeing local newspapers are nearly gone. They've been completely eliminated, leaving many cities without any newspapers. I'll let you read that article if you wish. But here's all the news deserts that are being created. So we see all of these places that no longer have newspapers. A total of 2,100 have been lost. So here's the summary. Democracies need independent, fact-based journalism to provide a voice for a diverse range of people, to watchdog the powerful, and to keep members of society informed. Study after study has found that without access to local news, people are less civically engaged and less likely to vote. The demise of local newspapers is also linked to a rise in local corruption. Of course, no one's checking on them, and an increase in political polarization, as news consumers rely more on partisan-inflected national outlets for information. Okay, interesting. So journalism is in decline. Local journalism is failing in the United States. Many of us learned in school that a free society requires a free press, but we rarely reflect on what it actually means to lose it. So the fourth estate, we call this, is the press, okay? The media that covers the activities of government and keeps the citizenry informed. Democracy relies on a fourth estate to check government and public power and educate the public. And Jefferson even said, educate and inform the whole mass of the people. They are the only sure reliance for the preservation of liberty. So in recent years, you have something I'm calling the fifth estate, which is citizen journalism and commentary, which has exploded because of the internet, because of new technology, okay? So where people are going out and doing it themselves. So can the internet replace mass media? Well, let's take a look. There are services and disservices. So you've got citizen activism, you've got a local perspective, personal issues, and individual anecdotes. That's all good, which we see in blogs. But disservices, untrained and no accountability. There's no editorial review. Sometimes they're lacking a larger perspective or larger information, like an editor to tell them certain details they might have missed. They might have a personal agenda, and also sometimes they're the source for misinformation. The internet has made anyone a reporter, commentator, and expert. This has greatly equalized effect on journalism, but also opens the door for propaganda, personal agendas, and people like Alex Jones. And McLuhan says to us, World War III is a guerrilla information war with no division between military and civilian participation. Aren't we seeing that in Ukraine? Aren't we seeing that with the fake news wars that are occurring on our internet waves? So now social media is a major source for news. About half Americans say they get some of it some of the time. Um, we see it being driven here. A lot of a lot of fake news is being driven by social media, okay? Much more in social media than actually in regular news sources. Social media accounts for a large portion of fake news spread. People share things easily without considering the integrity of the information. The convenience of spreading information on socials without any oversight makes it both a powerful and dangerous tool. I mean, think about it. Something comes into your phone, it intrigues you, it's from a friend, you share it. It may or may not be true. This is very common occurrence. So social media provides a growing percentage of the nation's news, but there are issues. Fake news. It's the #1 spreader of fake news, social media, big surprise. Echo chambers, filter bubbles, sensational headlines. We'll talk about all of these. Bias and political agenda. And of course, be aware of opinion versus news. So society now runs on convenience. It's extremely important to us, as we've talked about in previous lessons. Most people rate it very high. Um, what is right is often forgotten by what is convenient. That's a great statement. That's kind of where we are with our thoughts now. We're really very much interested in convenience over other values and forms. And remember what McLuhan says, it's often the form of the media, not the content, that has the greatest effect on it. And the speed and convenience of digital life is certainly having that today. I also want to point out that we've moved from a literate to a visual culture. That doesn't mean we're illiterate. And of course, that doesn't mean that they were unvisual, but we've seen a shift in society via technology. All right. In the past, people were reading, they had more fluency with words. Okay. They could talk face to face better, certainly. And, they were sort of prone to linear thought because that's what you see in the newspaper. Today, we are dominated by videos and audio, images, all of which tend to be more episodic and jump around. You go from one video to the next, and very often it may cut. So we've moved from a literate to a visual society. And we'll see that especially when we get into advertising, how we can see that manifest in advertisements. Okay, next topic, fake news and social media. So there's this massive new MIT study that analyzes every major contested news story in English across the span of Twitter's existence and finds that the truth simply cannot compete with hoax and rumor. By every common metric, falsehood consistently dominates the truth on Twitter. The study finds fake news and false rumors reach more people, penetrate deeper into the social network, and spread much faster than accurate stories. And of course, repetition is the biggest part of that. If people hear it, if they get it shared by multiple people, they tend to believe it. Here's some examples of some fake news headlines that people actually believe. These are some of the percentage of people who thought that they were real. Remember, headlines are just advertisements for the stories, and sometimes fake news gets more clicks than real news. Twitter users seem almost to prefer sharing falsehoods, even when the research controlled for every variable. Falsehoods were 70% more likely to be shared. Now, there are Twitter bots, which you see here, that spread fake news and make it look like the story is getting traffic. But it's humans, not robots, that are more likely to spread fake news. And of course, that makes it more dangerous. You're going to believe something or at least read it when it comes from a friend or someone you know or a respected source. Even veterans of thriving papers are worried, especially about the fake news that has risen from the ashes of traditional media. We are, for the first time in modern history, facing the prospect of how societies will exist without reliable news. Most Americans are saying that it's not improving their understanding and it's leaving them confused. So we have this sort of consistency of opinion. So why is fake news shared? Well, it's more novel than real stories. It evokes more emotion. People believe stories that confirm their own bias. Now, most people are too busy to question the source of stories. I get it. You don't have time as you're going to work and you're reading on the bus to think about whether or not you need to research the story. You're just trying to get some information. Speed and convenience of social media is paramount. And interestingly, conservatives are more likely to believe and share false and dramatic posts like this one. Don't believe everything you read on the internet just because there's a picture next to it and a quote. So, recent evolution of fake news. Just a little background quickly. Fake news and information manipulation came to the public attention in the run-up to the 2016 presidential election. Trump began using the term throughout his campaign. And Cambridge Analytica used these targeted ads to incite people with false information and sway the election. So what they did is they could tell by people's Facebook posts what they believed, and so they sent them very targeted ads that said very dire things about candidates, and actually helped swing the election. And it's really this last decade that we've seen fake news come in. We had a lot connected to the pandemic. So what can we do? All right, enough bad news. Diversify your news sources. Consider alternative media. Learn to spot fake news. Avoid extremist news sites like Alex Jones. Wouldn't recommend it. Pay attention to emotional manipulation. Okay, anytime that they're trying to make you feel, trying to get you angry, or they themselves are angry or acting angry, you might want to check it. Check your own bias. Make sure that you're not judging things from just your perspective. It's okay if you do. We all have bias, but we still need to remember to check it. And most importantly, take responsibility. Here are some various ideas you can look at. Check the author, the supporting sources, the date. Sometimes we have old stories that get recycled. Ask experts, because it's not what gets us into trouble is not what we don't know. It's what we know for sure that just ain't so. Mark Twain. Check yourself. False information online is often really novel and frequently negative. Okay, so we know that there are those two features of information generally that grab our attention the most, and what's caused us to share information with others. Okay, so we're attentive to novel threats and especially attentive to negative threats. This is what I was saying earlier. So novel means new, something unique. Okay, it's something new coming into your world. And we know what negative means. So when you see something negative or novel, you're going to be more likely to react to it and more likely to click on it because of that. So here's some steps on how to spot fake news: confirm the source, check the facts, quality counts, read before you share, speak up. So we're going to finish this section with a little film. You might want to turn up the volume for your video clip. We're just going to watch about 2 minutes of this clip because it sums up a lot of what I've been talking about and provides some new interesting details. Let's watch.
The presses are now printing the final edition of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer.
Newspapers like the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, the Rocky Mountain News, and hundreds more have now become relics from the past. Fresh budgets have stopped the presses at newsrooms nationwide. Mass layoffs throughout media have meant far fewer journalists to investigate policy and procedure.
We're losing a sense of accountability in government, in business, in all our lives, if we lose journalists who aren't asking questions. about what's going on.
The numbers, particularly dramatic with newspapers, where revenue has been cut nearly in half. While the journalism industry is shrinking, the public relations industry is expanding. At one time, a 1-to-1 ratio between PR employees and journalists. Today, that ratio is 4-to-1, with PR revenues jumping from $3.5 billion to $8.7 billion.
Journalists are simply overwhelmed by folks who are trying to spin them, who are trying to create their own story. You have the public relations folks, the spin doctors, if you will, driving the news cycle.
John Nichols, along with Robert McChesney, wrote a book about it, The Death and Life of American Journalism.
In a sense, we are becoming one of the most propagandized countries in the world.
Short-staffed news stations often use company video news releases, or VNRs, like this one.
If you have eczema, chances are the first symptoms showed up before the age of 5.
PR, disguised as news.
The new treatment.
Okay, we'll stop it right there. Whoops. So, yeah, what we saw in that last piece there was that now PR agents, people that are essentially journalists for a specific client, trying to get that story out, the story that the client has crafted for the public, they now outnumber journalists 4-to-1. That was the major takeaway from that. And when we get into PR and what public relations are and what they do and things like damage control, we'll learn more about that. So, okay, now this brings us to question 2. What effects have declining newspapers had on journalism? Okay, what effects have the decline of newspapers had on journalism? Newspapers have been in decline. So what is that leading to? What are we seeing? We discussed the effects in the lecture, so please share that. You can write that down now and answer in Canvas, or you can continue on with me. Okay, let's move on. All right. So this is our final section, and we're talking about media literacy. Okay, very important topic. I want to give you guys some tools. So don't check out, stay aware. Become self-aware of your own bias. Be diligent, do the research, and realize media issues and adapt. So we're going to talk about filter bubbles, echo chambers, confirmation bias, misinformation, disinformation. Here we go. Filter bubble. A filter bubble is an algorithmic bias that skews or limits the information an individual user sees on the internet. Everywhere you go online, algorithms keep track of what you do and what you like to click on. These algorithms give you content based on what they think you like. Okay, right? We all know this. This is how Netflix works, okay? So they keep showing content that you are likely to consume. This creates the filter bubble whenever you're using a search engine, okay? So this is an example of a piece of technology, which is a good piece of technology, creating unintended consequences. So search engines generate filter bubbles. Here's a great example. Google's filter bubble. 87 people across the US searched Google at the same time, logged out and in private browsing mode. They all got different results from gun control, okay, depending on where they were and depending on who they were and what Google thought they might be interested in, okay? So there are services and disservices to this. Search engines feed us our interests. They know what we like and they keep giving us to us. That works great on Netflix. Disservice, they keep us insulated in a filter bubble. So that doesn't work so great when it comes to news stories or information that might be important to our lives. Then we're kind of getting a filter. It's giving us what we've already said we liked in the past, excluding things we might want to learn about in the future. So an echo chamber, next one, media landscape in which beliefs are amplified or reinforced by communication and repetition inside a closed system. Echo chambers increase social and political polarization and extremism. With no voices to oppose these outlandish ideas in an echo chamber, they grow and become dangerous. And the perfect example is Alex Jones' InfoWar. He recently was found guilty and is ordered to pay over $50 million in damages to Sandy Hook parents, where he claimed that the children they died were actors. And he had this very elaborate campaign inside of an echo chamber. And this is one of the negative results. Is there anger or outrage in the writing? Say, this is how we recognize echo chambers. And certainly with Alex Jones, this is suitable. Is there anger or outrage in the writing? He was literally apoplectic every day on the air. Do they only give one perspective on an issue? Is there credible evidence provided or just interpretation or innuendo? Like, watch labeling adjectives like radical and extremist. You will often see these shows really label and just act as if the people they're discussing are just the worst people ever. Does the site report information or tell you how to feel about an event? And are critics or opposing opinions attacked? If people that come in with opposing opinions, maybe in the chat room, are they attacked? That's a really good sign. So how do you avoid an echo chamber? Don't assume when you consume. Okay, don't assume when you consume media. Check multiple sources to ensure you're getting complete objective info. Interact with people of different perspectives and discuss new ideas with facts, patience, and respect. Just because you want something to be true doesn't make it fact. And this is something we all have to do, including myself, including most adults. Confirmation bias, next one, is the tendency to search for, interpret, and recall information in a way that supports what we already believe. Now, this isn't anything weird. It's natural. You're going to remember things that you liked, that made sense to you, that agreed with information you already had. Okay, so here's what confirmation bias looks like. Here are the facts. Here's what you believe. In the area where those overlap, you tend to overvalue these. People display this bias when they select information that supports their views, ignoring contrary information, or when they interpret ambiguous evidence as supporting their existing attitudes. This was very common on InfoWars. So how to reduce confirmation bias? Allow yourself to be wrong. Stay open-minded. Challenge your assumptions. Where did you get your assumptions? Were they given to you by your society, by media? And of course, always be beware of repetition. Often when politicians or certain religious figures use repetition a lot, they're taking advantage of a weakness within the mental makeup of human beings, which is a message that is repeated over and over again tends to take on truth in our mind. We tend to believe it more because of the repetition, okay? And this, of course, is how advertising works. Why do you think they pay so much money to show you the same commercial over and over again? This is how music on the radio works. Music that's played over and over again, people begin to like. So repetition is something we see used throughout media. Okay, looks like I forgot the heading here, but well, it's okay. So now we're going to talk about basically what's been going on in the media in terms of disinformation. So we broke it down into three categories. There's misinformation. So that's disinformation and malinformation. So misinformation is unintentionally distributing incorrect information. So this is very common on social media. These people aren't in a conspiracy. They just share something that isn't true or, has bad facts. Disinformation is knowingly developing and disseminating incorrect information intended to deceive. Now, these are bad actors, often foreign states, often very radical players, and this is straight up propaganda. Okay, so both are somewhat common on social media, but this one is intended as propaganda. It's malicious. And then there's something called malinformation, and that's when basically some personal information is released for shock value. So like a smear campaign, all right? So misinformation, someone sends you information about Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster. That could be, misinformation. And misinformation is shared often when it's sensational or it confirms our biases. Okay, this is very common. It's not malicious necessarily, just ignorant or a little hasty. Disinformation is the one we have to watch out for. Disinformation is information that is just wrong with a deceptive strategy behind it. Disinformation is propaganda maliciously intended to slander, distract, or mislead, okay? They don't have to necessarily change your mind. They just have to kind of muddy the waters, kind of make things unclear, confuse people. Often disinformation tells a specific audience what they want to hear or believe. Its power is derived from being spread by the public. So if you don't like Hillary Clinton, and you see this, and you might be inclined to share it because it confirms what you believe. And lastly, malinformation is a lot of celebrity gossip and what people do and say about each other when they're in court or to damage their reputation in the press. So some things to look out for, okay? Satire or parody, okay, that's at the low end. False connection when headlines, visuals, or captions don't support the content. Misleading content. False context when genuine content is shared with false contextual information. Imposter content when genuine sources are impersonated. So very often bots will impersonate sources online. Manipulated content. Now this is when they alter a photograph or they only include part of a statement. And then straight up fabrication. So we're going from low to high. So sort of playing around with the truth versus completely generating a false truth in terms of disinformation. So where does this all come from? So we've discussed a little bit of it. So we have a collapsing of the traditional models of business, of the media. We also now have peer-to-peer news, and these two things are connecting. As peer-to-peer news, that social media has grown, so I can just share anything with you directly. We've seen the traditional models begin to break down. And this has created a lot of new ecosystems, including echo chambers. So we have this loss of confidence in traditional media. We've been discussing that today. People have lost faith, and particularly in the mass media and mainstream media. We have echo chambers going on, and we have peer-to-peer sharing. Okay, these three things combine through social media to produce and generate fake news. And a lot of people are concerned. For example, this UNESCO World Trends report says social media poses an existential threat to traditional trustworthy news. So just a word on the broken business model. I've touched on this, but I wanted to hit it again. Multinational corporate ownership monopoly. So we got 5 corporations owning all of our media. For-profit business model. So it's profit over truth and integrity. They've got to basically finance themselves. So whatever the public is going to be drawn to, even if it's not good for them, they're going to give it to them. So profit over truth and integrity. They're beholden to advertisers. They're driven by the advertising industry and how they spend their revenue. So what's happened is declining revenues has led to desperate actions to attract audience. So therefore, sensationalism, bias, clickbait, false drama, hype, and any number of things that you might come up with that we've discussed is what we're seeing. And because look, here it is. The internet is taking off in terms of its revenue. Most other advertising spending is in decline. The internet has revolutionized information sharing and stole audiences from traditional media. This disruption has been felt most in ad revenue. Online ads are cheaper and they reach wider audiences. So we got to adapt to this new reality. Around the world, disinformation is spreading and becoming a complex phenomenon based on emerging technologies of deception. So disinformation is undermining human rights and many elements of a good democracy. So it's partly to do with this broken business model. Here's some insane examples. But there's some critical voices. Robert McChesney, which you've heard from a couple times in this lesson, said any effort to reform the media system would have to necessarily be a part of a revolutionary program to overthrow the capitalist system itself. So he's saying that they're so intertwined that the reform in the media isn't likely to happen unless we're revisiting almost the baseline of our society. Now that's a little bit dire. I'm not sure if I totally agree with him, but it's a stark opinion, a stark perspective. So let's look at some hope for journalism, okay? Where we might find some hope and some ways to get out of this problem that we're in, okay? So we're going to look at these various examples. First off, I hope you're familiar with joke journalism. John Oliver, all the various guys on the news, Seth Green in the nighttime, all these great joke journalists. Bill Maher does it. They're funny. Why are they succeeding? They're funny. It appeals to the younger generation, and they cover the news in a way that's easier to digest than depressing media. It reflects a growing disregard for the traditional news. And I don't think this is a bad thing because viewers in surveys often are more informed than regular news watchers, okay? And they often, as you can see here, do really biting and investigative journalism in these shows. I think they're a fine source for news, and they've only grown. So we mentioned investigative journalism. And this is something that we saw a lot in the 60s and 70s, but also recently in 2000s here, connected to the Catholic Church scandal. So it's not enough for journalists to see themselves as mere messengers, okay, without understanding the hidden agendas of the message and the myths that surround it. This is from a very recognized investigative journalist. Investigative journalism means the unveiling of matters that are concealed, either deliberately by someone in a position of power, and the analysis and exposure of all relevant facts to the public. Okay, so investigative journalists just don't show up and ask and just get the report, basically report the press release. That's what the PR agent does. They give the press release to the reporter. And unless he's an investigative journalist, he's just going to repeat the facts. But investigative journalist goes much further. And many say that they're absolutely essential to a democracy. They're often very attacked, as you see here. We have lots of these folks being attacked. If you're interested in helping, you can go here because it's very important, because they dig in the dirt and they uncover the buried bodies. In addition to that, we have citizen journalism. This is a shot from Occupy movement of 2011, which was very big on citizen journalism. Everyone with a camera is now a potential reporter, and we see people showing up and recording all kinds of events. Now, this has, services and disservices of the audience wanting to participate in the news event, but I think it has a lot of positive. Why have we had so many cases of police brutality in the last 20 to 30 years? Because we've had people with phones. Most of those cases were documented by an innocent bystander documenting the violence with their phone. And it was that phone record which became the basis for the case against the police officers. It's an example of the technology changing society. So documentaries are becoming more popular, as you see here. We've seen an explosion of film festivals, documentary film festivals, lots of cheap, high quality equipment. Schools are cranking out filmmakers who can't break into Hollywood. And the growth of streaming has really, led to the need for more and more content. So a lot of documentaries on the streaming services. This is a good thing. And here's where you can go and find a bunch of fantastic documentaries. I highly recommend Canopy, and it's free. It's completely free with your library card. So here's some other ones. You can usually find these for free. I think most of these are for free. And so lots of great documentaries out there to watch. And of course, on Netflix and Amazon and Hulu, there's also very good documentaries because they're becoming quite popular. Alternative news sources that you could check out. A lot of these are great sources. Many people are turning to these because without corporate ownership and advertisers, they are free to pursue stories that mainstream media will not touch. Also, we see foreign news services. A lot of people, Al Jazeera and BBC, are known to be very good, especially about issues when they look at America, because they have an outsider's perspective on American issues. So we're in the summary. Newspaper readership and revenue is in decline. Journalism is in decline due to slashed budgets, declining standards, and corporate ownership monopoly. News media is profit-driven, offering spectacles and fear to draw viewers. Media bias is common in corporate-owned media, promoting a false left-right paradigm and image politics. Those are all things we discussed. Fake news and disinformation are on the rise and a threat to democracy. Social media has been the greatest spreader of fake news, yet more people are turning to it. More and more Americans are getting their news digitally and from alternative sources. The transition from print media to audio-visual media has turned news into entertainment. It's now, think about it, reading about a fire versus watching footage from a fire or any disaster completely changes the experience entirely. So, final thoughts. It starts with you. We're talking about media literacy. This is the whole goal of this class, is to give you media literacy. And I wanted in this class to focus on some definite tools that you could use. As an informed citizenry is the backbone of democracy. Make sure you are doing your part by being informed and being aware. Here's some things that you can think about. Think, is it true? Is it helpful? Is it inspiring? Is it necessary? Is it kind? Think before you post. Final question. Explain 3 things we can all do to improve our media literacy. So here you're repeating what you've learned in the lecture. Explain 3 things we can all do to improve our media literacy. Now notice I said explain, so that doesn't mean just list. You've got to explain them. Explain 3 things that we can all do to improve our media literacy. Remember to write down the question and answer in Canvas. I'm going to go ahead and stop the lecture now. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. We'll stop the share. And here I am back. Really important lecture today. I hope you guys enjoyed it and took something from it. And remember, the intent of this whole course is to give you guys media literacy, to help us better translate the difficult media times that we live in. Okay, hope you're well.